like generally states are not they don't govern in the interest of the people. I think under capitalism, right, most states are very much captured by private interests and private entities. Like in particular, egregious example is the United States, and how much, I mean, like bribery is just straight up legal. We just call it lobbying. Like as leftists, I think if you are on the more radical side, at least, like you are in many ways and in many points in history would be considered a criminal, and you have to find ways to like protect yourself and your organization from like what those damages could be.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Artifact 56. I am joined today by Josh Davila. He's the author of Blockchain Radicals. Normally, I would pick it up and show you the title, but I have it on my Kindle. I just finished reading the book sometime. Well, he has a copy.
I'll do it for you.
Yeah, very nice. So I finished it last night, and I wanted to talk about this topic simply because especially with the last cryptocurrency cycle, 2021 into early 2022, it was kind of obvious that, first of all, this is something that is here to stay. But secondarily, me being a pretty left wing, it's obvious to me, just like witnessing the crypto Twitter space. I don't know if it's just kind of like a selection bias or whatnot, but it's pretty obvious that crypto has been more or less taken over by right wingers, at least culturally, at least those that are highly visible. It tends to break fairly right wing, and we could talk about why that is. But overwhelmingly, it just seems to me like, well, if this is something that's here to stay, as a leftist, you should sort of do something to get involved. You shouldn't allow it to be just kind of hijacked by ideas that you disagree with. There's maybe some personalities that we could talk about as this show goes on. But the point is, I think if you sort of understand what blockchain is specifically, what Bitcoin is, what NFTs are, people will come away with the understanding that, there's no way that this thing can go away. The cat is out of the bag. The way all this functions is out of the bag. So we're going to have to deal with it in some way. And we could either allow right wingers to take control, or we could sort of try to like establish a more kind of coherent political program on top of all this. And maybe we could begin with some recent news. So yesterday, there was the approval of the Bitcoin ETF in the United States. And this is something that's been kind of in the works for a very long time. There's been all these ETF denials that, I don't follow exactly the legal arguments, but it does seem to me that the legal arguments from the beginning were kind of shaky for denying an ETF. So people were expecting this for almost a decade at this point. It finally passed. And this is an inflection point for crypto. At the very least, it just kind of legitimizes, maybe not some of the narratives, but at the very least, it legitimizes the fact that, again, this thing exists, and now other kinds of players and maybe would not be involved, now they're going to be getting involved. And maybe we could start with the question of what do you think this is going to do long term for cryptocurrency, blockchain? Do you think this is going to have some sort of disciplining effect on Bitcoin, right? If Bitcoin has any kind of money properties, eventually it's going to have to be less volatile. Maybe this is a disciplining factor that would help bring this about. So what is your response to the approval, and does it have any relevance to leftists working in this space?
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, first, thanks for having me. Like you mentioned, my name is Josh Davila. I run a blog and a podcast called The Blockchain Socialists, and I've been kind of following the crypto space from a left-wing point of view for the past about 4 years. And the book came out this past August through Repeater Books, based in the UK. But yeah, the news was not so surprising in that the past at least couple of months, at least we can say, like people were like the general sentiment was like very positive and like pretty sure that this was going to happen anyways, even though there was, certain rhetoric from, I believe, like Gary Gensler and other types of people. Jamie Dimon, of course, is like usually on the circuit saying negative things about Bitcoin. But I think generally, like the creation of the ETF is not so surprising, and it's not as like if you want to look at crypto from like a more radical lens, from a more political lens, like it's uh, basically looks it is basically a form of co-optation, I guess I could say, in that Bitcoin has is like and has already been in the process of being subsumed into kind of like the status quo of financial institutions, which is very contradictory if you think about kind of the, let's say, the more idealistic Bitcoiners who think that Bitcoin really should be like completely separate from, the existing financial system and create its own thing where people now have like more sovereignty or whatever arguments it is that they use. Um, but I think it shows that this, in like very crude dialectics, if you really have like the thesis of financial institutions, the antithesis was supposed to be Bitcoin. But I think what we've seen is kind of like this synthesis of both of these two together, where now Bitcoin is like sort of in the process of being subsumed into these financial institutions. So, I mean, I think this mostly just shows that, like you mentioned earlier, that it's probably going to stay whether you like it or not, as things exist. I'm not saying that that means that you should go and buy Bitcoin because of the ETF. I'm not someone to predict price or anything like that. But I think the idea in the past that in the past people have kind of like expressed of like that we need to make crypto completely illegal and completely ban it or whatever seems unlikely, at least in like the context of the US.
Yeah, one ironic portion to all of this is there's definitely a contingent of crypto activists and whatnot that believe that the ETF is bad, right? I mean, beyond like questions
Mhm.
of price, there's like all these theories about like, is it going to be good for price, bad for price? Here's ways there's positive, ways there's negative. I mean, whatever. But beyond that, the idea that because now there's all these like big players involved and they're legitimate crypto in this way, it's a violation of crypto ethos. The way that I always viewed
Mhm.
it is, well, if Bitcoin is going to have some sort of like long-term use case, uh, it's going to have to be, it's going to have to be like, even if we sort of assume that Bitcoin has a digital gold narrative and this is the way that it's going to play out in the long term, in the same way that if like if you were to chart out gold going back, let's say, from its discovery up until now, early on in its history, definitely the chart would have looked like this, right? Maybe upon discovery, people are like, well, this beautiful object, obviously it's going to be worth a lot. We're going to treat it as such. And then maybe 2 months later, there's a cyclical famine that affects everybody. And now gold is worth nothing. Goats are worth much more than gold. And this kind of, goes back and forth until society sort of disciplines itself and famines become maybe like less prominent. Gold could sort of, insinuate itself in other ways in markets and eventually just kind of stabilizes and more or less tracks inflation over the long term. That doesn't mean that, anytime there's an inflation hike, it's going to immediately shoot up but over the long term, it tends to track it. And if Bitcoin is going to have any kind of functionality like that, it probably would need an ETF just for that disciplining factor, right? So at the very beginning, I think just kind of like intellectually, the kinds of designs that are put upon Bitcoin and the plans that people have for it. From the very beginning, there's this kind of disconnect between how society actually functions. It was never going to be banned, right? This is the odd thing. Like like maybe certain things might be banned, maybe certain ways of doing crypto could be banned, but like it was never going to be banned. And those that expect and like if you were sort of like assuming that it was going to be banned and it's going to be us against the state, you're not gonna win that conflict, right? If you have essentially if you're like protecting, little more than what amounts to tokens, right? The state is always going to win out. And ultimately, maybe we could just talk about like Bitcoin in general a little bit, but like the way that I view it is it's going to be something that probably coexists. I'm not somebody that at all believes in things like a debt crisis or spending too much. But the fact is, like, you could, like, if you live, if you're a left winger in any kind of nation state in the world, you will definitely find ways in which spending is done incorrectly. Like that could be anything like slush funds and funding genocides in Palestine, or it could be like whatever. It could be just a misuse of funds in other ways. If that happens, you know that there is some kind of debasement going on. And if Bitcoin is going to be something that potentially protects you against these worst case scenarios, that in and of itself, I think, is a sufficient reason for its existence. And it tends to like default to, fewer rather than more regulations, because I mean, just the existence of like a Bitcoin wallet probably like is a violation of some sort of laws, but they're still not going to ban that. and instead there's going to be workarounds. And I think that kind of puts not privacy first, but at least some level of a personal accountability first, in a way where maybe the state can't get so easily involved. So, like, what are your thoughts on Bitcoin in general? Is it dead as a leftist project? Because I mean, it is fairly concentrated wealth at this point. Or because in your book you barely talk about Bitcoin, so have you just totally tossed it aside as relevant to leftism?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely most of the kind of like sections where I talk about Bitcoin is mostly at the beginning, just because paying homage to the like first cryptocurrency that existed, and it's worth explaining that one first before getting to the other ones, because it's the most simple one as well. But I mean, in general, yeah, I would say that if you are on the left and you're thinking about using crypto as a tool for some sort of thing that you want to do, most likely the like a different cryptocurrency will be more interesting than Bitcoin. It could be maybe you're in a situation where Bitcoin is like really the only one you can use, and that makes sense for that specific context. But I really think it's context specific. But I'm willing to bet that, you know, the vast majority of cases you can use something else besides Bitcoin that might be more desirable than Bitcoin. So I mean, I think there is a chance. The main kind of examples or use cases that I kind of land out in the book are these. I mean, what happened in the past already with WikiLeaks, where they had in 2010, 2011 had released the Cablegate papers, where they showed all these war crimes being committed by the U.S. and its allies in the Middle East, and then they had their financial services blocked off. So they had like economic sanctions, financial sanctions thrusted upon them. They couldn't access a lot of their money in different places, but they had started accepting Bitcoin as a way to receive donations, and that was like the first time that Bitcoin had this like clear use case. Like people were able to send Bitcoin, nobody could stop it. And then they were able to use that Bitcoin to fund their infrastructure, and that turned out to be like a wildly successful bet that they made, even though like at the time Satoshi Nakamoto, like one of his last messages was telling WikiLeaks like don't do that for whatever reason. He said Bitcoin wasn't ready, but they did it anyways, and it ended up being a good bet. So I think in these situations of economic and financial sanctions, if those are thrusted upon you, or if that's a threat of that being thrusted upon you, then cryptocurrency generally is like something that can be useful. Whether Bitcoin is better for that than other ones, I'm a little bit skeptical, but maybe you're in a country where, I don't know, for some reason, the infrastructure for Bitcoin is a whole lot better than like Ethereum, for example, or something like that. But I would say generally, like it is pretty, like I don't find much, like I spend not so much time focusing on Bitcoin for my own podcast or my own writing, just because I do feel that it is quite captured at this point, and it's hard for me to see any wiggle room for really where there is like radical left wing potential there, except in like very niche circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's a little bit of a value neutral element to Bitcoin left. Again, like alluding to the idea of whether you're, it's kind of like a blank slate in some ways, where, yes, it's been in terms of like culture at least captured very much by right wing ideology, but at the same time, it is inherently value neutral in the sense that you could be a left winger who believes that we are spending money incorrectly, and you would use the examples that I cited, such as you're funding a genocide in Palestine, you are exacerbating a war in Ukraine that shouldn't have happened in the first place, you are, whatever, right? You're not spending enough on a social safety net. Or you could be a right winger who, might be anti-war in some respects, but also doesn't want a social safety net. So it's
Mm.
value neutral in that sense. And in both those scenarios, like you could imagine a situation where there is like some sort of monetary debasement which goes on, and Bitcoin is going to be the thing that maybe helps. Again, this has not been tested out. We don't have evidence yet that it's behaving this way. My suspicion is long term it probably will start to behave in such a way, but that is all theoretical. What about questions of Bitcoin as money? In your book, you're kind of skeptical of this idea of cryptocurrency. You says it has money-like properties, but it's not really money, right? And perhaps you're using maybe a technical definition of money that people are less aware of. So can you comment a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. So definitely like the narrative in the crypto world, in Bitcoin world, I would say actually more specifically, oftentimes is that Bitcoin is money and it's the best money out there. It's the best money you can ever have. It's similar to gold and the gold standard. And, all of our problems started whenever, the United States left the gold standard. And now we need to go back and we can show our support for doing that by buying Bitcoin. But I think there is this like, yeah, kind of big misunderstanding about what money actually is and how it works in like the Bitcoin community. I think they have like very, very rigid and like almost like too specific of idea of what makes money. They think like the idea that you can just, if you believe something is money, or if you just like kind of use it as money within your circle, therefore makes it money, almost like we're like willing it to be. But I think there's a lot more bigger systemic and institutional factors to take into account whether we want to say something is like really money. Of course, this is always like on a spectrum. So I'm trying to like not completely say that like it's not money and it's ridiculous for you to say so, because there are a lot of like similar properties. Of course, I can send and receive Bitcoin in the same way that I can send and receive money. So in like some ways it looks like money. But money has like these like real characteristics. The most common, or like one way that I like to kind of explain this difference is through like whenever you want to buy something in Bitcoin, let's say online, like e-commerce, say you're on the dark web and you're buying weed or something like that. The weed, like the object, the commodity you want to buy online is going to be priced in dollars usually, and then it's going to convert that into what that means in Bitcoin. So like every day or however much amount of time, the price is changing depending on the relationship, the price of Bitcoin related to the actual money, which is dollar. So what is the thing priced in is what the money is, right? So it would be dollar. So what you're doing when you're like using the dark web, for example, then you are doing what's called a counter trade, where you are trading the Bitcoin in the amount like equal to the amount of money at that moment and trading it for, the thing that you're buying. And that's like a financial, you know, uh, thing that people do in financial markets all the time. They'll trade commodities. It's almost like barter, except where there's like an imaginary number of money in which that counts. So for me, uh, just to conclude, is that Bitcoin isn't money, but that's not a bad thing. That in fact, it is actually quite good that Bitcoin is not money. And it is the reason why organizations like WikiLeaks, like SciHub is another one, they're able to use cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin in order to receive donations, to receive money, to pay for things because it is not money. So the fact that it cannot be blocked um, like is in a way it is not money in a digital and through digital platforms.
Yeah, I agree with you that yeah, I would be kind of hesitant to outright call something like Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency money, but at the same time, the money-like properties they're not only there, but they seem to be accelerating in some ways because, I mean, even like for instance, using some of the examples you cited in the book, you have your bread token, I believe it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is basically kind of like a chain for for like social good, social activism, where basically you use a DAI deposit, which is a stable coin deposit into AV for some sort of interest returns. These interest returns are then recycled into causes that one believes in. There's no actual like immediate financial benefit because the bread token is pegged to the DAI stablecoin, which itself is pegged to $1, right? Which only very rarely deviates from $1. And that in itself, like we're still kind of like at the stage in cryptocurrency where the phrase cryptocurrency, like it's kind of critical to what's happening in the sense that everything is still kind of like pure financialization in various ways. You could use it for different purposes, but it's still financialization. You wrote a blog post about during the 2020 eviction crisis. It was something along the lines of it's a token for like
Housing for all
housing for
token.
all, yeah, housing for
Yeah.
all token. And even that, like in some senses, okay, so it would be like a token that would basically, I'm not sure if it would work like as an NFT or whatever, where it's like, okay, where the metadata in this NFT indicates that, this is a guy who's a single father, right? Or this is a woman, this is a couple, right, with two children. And obviously you're going to have different kinds of housing units depending on these different needs. But even that in and of itself, like something like housing, it has a kind of scarcity attached to it, right? And part of that scarcity would also obviously be the fact that personhood is scarce, right? Human beings are a minority on this planet. We have many more cows than we have people. We have many more bacteria and other animals versus people. So they don't get personhood. We do. As people, we're entitled to these housing units. That kind of scarcity, that it's still a kind of financialization. Yes, it's more roundabout, but we're still dealing with these kinds of financialization schemes. Like, do you imagine blockchain utility? And we should honestly, after this, just like define blockchain for people that are confused, because my audience that probably doesn't really know much about this. But like, do you think like crypto is going to get beyond this? These models of scarcity, non-scarcity, financialization with different like spectrums of that. Like, do you think we're going any way other than that direction? Like, are we going to put anything else like on chain and use it that it's not just I don't want to say the word profit, right? But it's like some sort of financialization scheme, whether for good or ill. Still, we're talking about financialization.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that uh, it has happened to a certain extent in many ways. Um, like I mean, there, although people we might talk about it later, but like there are NFTs, for example. I mean, people buy NFTs also not necessarily for wanting to generate a profit, right? There is definitely a market for NFTs where people are trying to buy a piece of art and then sell it for a profit. But NFTs are not just like crypto art. They're not just like digital image. They're a little bit more complicated and a little bit more. There are reasons to like want to use these things for non-financialized reasons. I think it's important maybe to define financialization. Financialization kind of means that you are commoditizing more or marketizing more some type of service or product, which was not done that way before. So I would argue that like, a housing for all token, let's say, that I mentioned in the book, that's an anti-financialization scheme, I would argue, because it's opposing the real estate market or choosing to allocate our housing resources via markets and instead choosing to allocate it based on needs of the community. So it would be like an anti-financialization. But I think in general, yes, there is like this trend and need and desire to move away from financialization, although there is still a very, very strong contingency of people who wants to financialize everything pretty much. But there has been like an increase, for example, in like different types of like new forms of social media that use blockchains that are on chain. That I would argue they're it's hard to say whether they're doing more financialization by using on-chain kind of functions, or that they're making the financialization that's already present in currently existing social media platforms and simply making them visible.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's like perhaps a debate or conversation between people to have on that, which just is happening. But yeah, I think in general as well, like we will have to create those applications that are non-financialized, and we will have to like take part in using them. It's just like really hard, I think, for a lot of people whenever just kind of like the status quo in crypto world is if you want to get a lot of if you want to get enough money for people to for you to build the infrastructure for that application, you have to provide some sort of incentive, and that's I think related to just like the general problems of capitalism that we live under.
Yeah, I mean, like in general, just human beings. Obviously, we work according to incentive structures, right? It's true that these could get very much warped, and it's true that many incentives are unjustifiable. But still, like we kind of work on the basis of incentives. So let's define
Yeah.
blockchain. So for people that either don't know about it or are skeptical, right, don't quite understand the value proposition, what is your like best top down analysis of what blockchain is outside of Bitcoin. When we say blockchain, we don't just mean Bitcoin. We mean the technology behind it. Bitcoin being, I believe, the first blockchain project. So how would you define that for skeptics?
Yeah. So blockchain refers to both a data structure, like a very particular data structure, and uh, as well, it alludes to like a kind of infrastructure that upkeeps that data structure. So it's essentially a database that is held redundantly. So it's the same kind of entries in a database are being held in multiple places. Those places are computers, and they're called peers or nodes, or they're even like a type of server. But data is held across many different computers and machines, and they are constantly sharing data between one another about what is the current state of the database or the ledger, which keeps track of, for example, how much Bitcoin we hold, how much Bitcoin you're sending, you're receiving. Um, and so, in kind of standard practice in creating technological implementations for a lot of applications that we use today, like a lot of big tech products, Google, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, whatever else, we are inside an architecture called a client server model, right? We have the server in the middle, which has all of the data for that application that is owned by, insert giant tech company here. We have clients, which are like our applications on our phone or web applications. So we make requests to that server saying, hey, I want to post this. And you send it to the server, it does some sort of checks, and then it sends it out to the rest of the clients, right? It has all these processes internal, and all of that is owned by a private entity that wants to make profits, that wants to make money. And the thing that it owns is your data. And so it has to make money some way in, like, by owning your data, which is usually in the form of packaging and repackaging different sort of combinations of people's profiles to marketers and people who pay for advertising, right? That's generally how they make their money. In the situation of a blockchain, the data that you create is technically owned by you in a way that you are able to control yourself without needing an intermediary necessarily for that control. So you use what are called PGP, or like PGP keys. Like you have an address. So this is like a long string of letters and numbers that you generate. So that's for you, and you are able to share that with people for them to send you cryptocurrency, for example. And then you also generate a different set of random numbers and letters called a private key that you keep secret and that you use in order to access what is inside your wallet. And so you're not, whereas in the client server model, you have to create an account, right? You have to say, I'm Josh, this is my email, maybe I live here, this is my phone number, these are my security questions. You have to give all that information to the centralized company, and they hold it on their servers. And so you don't have to do that. And instead, you simply have to make sure you keep in a very safe spot your private key to access your assets and funds. So it kind of changes, it moves the responsibility a little bit, but has like a lot of big implications. But so with your private key, you are able to make transactions. You can say, I want to send a Bitcoin to Alex, and that gets sent to the network, which is basically all these computers that I mentioned before that are all checking with one another about the state of the database, of the ledger, of who has what Bitcoin and how much, for example. And then it takes that request and then it sends it out to the rest of the network. Whereas, if you were to take the big tech example, or even if we were to take like the example of big banks and how the financial institutions work today, we have to go through centralized entities who have a lot of information about us. And so when you send a transaction on a blockchain, usually in most blockchains, that information is public. So it shows that this address, this random strings of numbers and letters, is sending Bitcoin to this other random string of numbers and letters. So you have a kind of like pseudo anonymity in that space versus like Google knowing basically your entire life because they own all of that data.
Um,
Um, so yeah.
uh, I'm sorry, were you finished, or you want to add to that?
No, go
Because
ahead. Go ahead.
you said there's some. So like, what are these implications that you mentioned that are not so obvious at first? Like, what are the real implications of this kind of ownership?
So the real implications, good question. There's a lot of them. So kind of like got to summarize to think about
Mhm.
it. Like by you owning that data yourself, you're able to port, like you can move your uh, set of data, like you can move yourself to a different kind of service provider. So imagine if rather than like having Twitter, which is one organization that holds all the information, and you are kind of like trapped inside of Twitter's walled garden. Imagine instead, rather than thinking in platforms, we can think in protocols, which are we can think of as like pre-agreed upon rules for how data is used and managed. And then you can create several platforms that aren't walled off um, using that same protocol. So it's kind of similar to, I don't know if you know, like Secure Scuttlebutt or Mastodon to some degree,
Mhm.
like kind of federated social medias. But this takes it to, I think, a different level where this is also true for, I mean, using many different types of services that you would use through a blockchain. So one example or one way that I phrase it in the book, later in the book, is platform risk. So you maybe as a creator or an artist or even just as a user, you have a risk in choosing a platform that you decide to like spend your time on and to put your work, your art, your content on. And if that platform goes bust, which has happened many times before over the history of the internet, then you lose kind of all of your work that was there. And so compare this to what happened on the Tezos blockchain a couple of years ago, where they had kind of like an NFT marketplace that got really big really fast. Um, the guy who created it wasn't expecting it, and at a certain point, he kind of burnt out. And so all of the kind of NFTs that were created on this platform, it's called hicetnunc. Um, at one point, because he ended the project quite abruptly, there was first like a fear. Everyone thought that they had lost their artwork, but actually, what happened is that the Tezos blockchain was still running, right? It was still had the record of all of the NFTs, who owned it, the metadata about it, all this. And so what ended up happening is people just started creating new front ends that simply showed the data of all of the NFTs that were created on hicetnunc before. So then there became an explosion of many different platforms that all showed the same information and data. So you can also think of it, if you are like a developer or something like that, or know a little bit about computers, then it's almost like a shared backend in which you're able to create many different front ends to show that data. So you imagine like you have Twitter A, B, C, D, E, like all these different Twitters in which you're all seeing the same data, but it's being presented to you in different ways that maybe like fits that current need, for example. That's kind of like a really
Mhm.
big implication in my view.
Yeah, that's an interesting example for a couple of reasons. First of all, the mere fact that what was this in 2021 where that marketplace took off? There was a reason why it happened in 2021, which is because it was an extremely frothy market.
Yeah.
So in this kind of essentially game of hot potato, people are just moving around funds, and it's essentially where who's going to be the first one to drop this potato, right? Who's going to be caught with this thing, and like Ethereum, right, was getting saturated both in terms of like fees, because some of those L2s were not really mainstream yet. And just like, so we're like looking for some kind of new outlet. Tezos suddenly has this like new marketplace, and everybody moves their money on that because it's gonna jack up the price. So that just kind of like function. That's how, a lot of cryptocurrency works, simply because every single, like I've said this kind of example before, but it's like if you take a chart of Bitcoin or whatever, and you drop down to like any level, whether it's like a 4 hour, daily, weekly, monthly, you're gonna have like tons of wicks. On every single one of those wicks, somebody is impaled, right? on every single one of those wicks, someone makes a bunch of money. On every one of those wicks, somebody's like dreams collapse or dreams begin or like whatever. Um,
Mm.
at the same time, it's kind of it's kind of telling how like this is specifically when it gets expanded in terms of like when people hear about it, right? It's a very regressive kind of like if blockchain has like long-term utility, still we have to be serious about the fact that it's an extremely regressive tax in many ways, simply by the fact that for it to become popular, people need to get impaled on those wicks, right? Because they're only gonna worry about it and think about crypto when it's like, oh, the price is going up, right? When price is going down, like everybody knows, it's like people don't really talk about it. This is kind of what's happening, right? People are getting hurt along the way. Secondarily, though, these are people involved in crypto, right? They're at least they are at least educated enough to know how to use a wallet, to know how NFTs work, and yet they're they're very scared that the NFTs disappeared, which just kind of shows that in a baseline, even if these people involved, they don't really kind of understand what's going on, right? They don't understand that the value proposition is partly what you said, which is anybody can build on it, right? I think this is one of the key things that I want people to take away from this conversation. You have open source technology that, if you have like, if you release a token or you release some kind of NFT, if I decide to release an NFT of like one of my poems and I put, an image next to it or whatnot, and I say, you know what, like I'm not going to work on any utility on this. Like I have to work on my art, but if you want to, fund me directly, this is the best way to do it, whatever. Somebody could buy that and say, well, I have this NFT. Alex says I can now share my copyright, his copyright with me, if I want to publish this in some other way or whatever, or on chain. So I'm going to build out this like platform because Alex is too busy making art. So I'm going to now build this website that showcases all of art, Alex's artwork from the beginning when he first started publishing online to like now, and we could like analyze it. Now there's like some other kind of thing going on and somebody's doing it, right? They don't have to take my permission, right? All they do is build on top of it. Maybe they establish some kind of liquidity pool that it has my NFTs and maybe other poems that they respect. Suddenly now, like the value, like that's the thing. Like once I release it, it's kind of like releasing a wild animal, right? Into the world, and now it could like somebody could catch it and do something with it, right? I think that's very very a useful way of thinking about it. I remember even like when I was speaking to a developer that I know, a video game developer back in 2021 about NFTs, and I was saying how this could easily be something that is going to be like a part of gaming, and he couldn't wrap his mind around the fact that like an NFT token does not need to have something like, oh, this NFT means that this is always going to be a sword and an in-game object with the following stats, right? He doesn't understand that in many ways it is a blank slate, that any like you could have like, for example, the Mooncat NFTs on Ethereum. If you have a video game where you have like pets and you have like a function where it's like, all right, connect your wallet to the Ethereum blockchain. We know that you have a Mooncat in your wallet. Now this pet gets special kind of properties. You can define whatever property. There's no properties defined in the Mooncats other than, the fact that they are token on chain and there's metadata image where it looks like the way. And if you don't like the way it looks, you could redesign however you want for the purposes of your game, right? I think this is a part that people kind of like really miss when they write these articles about like, it's too complicated to put NFTs in gaming, and they say, and they use some of those like arguments about, stats can't be tied or like whatever. It's something that, and I think like in general, there's not really a lot of education even within the crypto community as to how all of this works. I don't know if you have any comments on anything that I just said, but
No, yeah, definitely. I think it's imagine let's also I would like to mention how this this property has been used in kind of like maybe with some more real implications as well. Is that uh, what often happens sometimes is that new applications will want to bring users to their application. They want to bring existing users, and they would like to target perhaps maybe specific users. Sometimes you could do, for example, because of the openness. Let's take a dumb example. I'm making a new application, and I want only like I want to incentivize like people with a lot of money or like a lot of crypto who like blue chip NFTs. Like let's just take about like a very capitalist example. I can say that like um if you are a holder of, the monkeys, the CryptoPunks, the whatever the other like big NFTs are, then when you come into my application, you already start off with like maybe more points or whatever for my game or for my app, whatever, so you can like use it as a way to also kind of encourage a certain audience. It might be interesting. So like with BreadChain, my project, the way that we're kind of thinking about it is it's a really interesting way to identify the people who would be most aligned with our vision of building like post-capitalist applications on the blockchain. So, we would want to find people who hold the NFTs that they would have purchased because they purchased that are related to like our writing that we've done before. Maybe we really like another community, like another smaller community that has like a lot of progressive values. We could choose like one of their tokens as, something that if you hold that token, then you will have more governance rights over like the way that we share our funds, for example. So there's a lot of like, I think untapped potential. You can use it for airdrops, what are called. So like, I have done before, like anybody who's done some on-chain activity where they supported my work, like I airdropped a token before. So I think this is like a really interesting implication as well when we think about, I don't know if you've heard much about exit to community, which I
Yeah, I
wrote
haven't
about in the
heard
book.
that.
I read a little bit about it in the book, but it's where, as a business, usually you have two choices as a founder to like make money. Either you sell your business to another company or you IPO. And those are very like, there's a lot of trade-offs with doing either of those things. Kind of third option that is proposed by Nathan Schneider, who's an academic who works a lot on worker cooperatives, is to sell your company to your community or to the people who are actually using your product. So this was shown in the case of Uniswap. Whenever Uniswap first started, or after they had started for a little bit, they created a governance token, the Uni token, and that token was airdropped to people who had used the Uniswap uh, decentralized exchange before, right? So then all these people, for having used their product, like made potentially some money. They earned this token. They could have sold it, or they could have kept it for voting power in that protocol. So yeah, so I think that's also like a really interesting use case there, that it makes it more, you have this legibility where you can make more interesting decisions than like is the case through other types of mediums, even technological ones.
Uniswap is a funny example because I remember during the time of the airdrop, when it like picked up value in 2021 or whatever, it was presented as, well, look at the amount of stimulus money that you got from the government, right, between two administrations, versus the fact
Mm.
that this Uniswap airdrop, I think its peak was something like $10,000 or $20,000. That in and of itself, like it kind of like it's a right wing argument in some ways, but at the same time, it does sort of like indicate, if you're like a rational state actor, and you see something like this, you should be thinking, instead of like, how do we quash this? You should be thinking, well, maybe we are the ones that are being too stingy, right? Maybe there is
Mm.
such a thing as a private threat that's emerging from all this. And the only reason why a private threat could emerge is because you as a state, you're not holding up your end of the social contract, right? Which obviously, looking back the last few years, right? So many violations of the social contract by the state. In some ways, like that's like another example of like it could be, parasitic in some ways, but it's a private check on state power. That, to me, the way that I interpret it is like you have to get your act together, government, right? You can't simply allow the outsourcing of everything. I mean, because everything is kind of like a trajectory towards privatization. Schooling is much more privatized in America now compared to like even like even like 10 years ago, right? With COVID, more people just like don't want to be in school, and that's a problem, right? Private schools should not exist at all. Like I think they should all be banned, but the state is not acting on its, like, it has to hold up its end of the bargain, and if it doesn't,
Yeah.
it's going to be a problem going forward. Secondarily, I wanted to ask you about a bread chain. Was there a specific reason why you decided to use DAI versus something like USDC? Was it as simple as like I forget the rates, whether DAI versus other coins yield more interest in AV, or is it that USDC is too centralized for your taste, and you don't like the fact that there is a large corporation behind it?
Yeah, I'd say it's that reason for the most part.
Hmm.
Is that DAI is a bit more decentralized. It's definitely not perfect,
Hmm.
but I think it is more interesting. I think I, I would have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure. I mean, for sure, with USDC, they will blacklist certain addresses because it is more centralized, so they can freeze your USDC if you are considered a threat or an enemy. And then I think in DAI they don't. In DAI they don't have that.
Hmm.
Um, so that was also like kind of those more kind of more ideological considerations were in our mind when we chose DAI. Otherwise, Tether I think gets the highest yield, but Tether
Hmm.
is like, I mean, potentially a ticking time bomb for a lot of people. So we don't want to use it.
Yeah, it's I always hear how nervous people are just kind of like holding it. They want to quickly get out like to something else. I do remember reading, I'm not sure how true this was, that at least part of in terms of you saying it's not perfect, I think part of DAI is kind of like in some ways, I forget how Circle has like some say over it, but you know, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. A lot of their collateral is USDC.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah.
It's part of the problem, man. But they've laid out plans to kind of phase that out or to like prevent more USDC from entering the collateral.
Hmm. Maybe we could talk about privacy a little bit and start with this idea of a digital identities in crypto and maybe kind of like the internet in general, going back a few decades. So first of all, one major thing that I noticed is that when I first started following you on Twitter, you're anonymous and now you're doxxed. And this is a common thing in crypto where people want to stay anonymous. And in your case, was it kind of like the common thing, like, all right, I want to be anonymous because I don't want somebody to like target me and rob me? Or is there this kind of like dishonor with being a leftist associated with crypto? Like what exactly is your was your thinking behind all that? And how are you dealing with the public persona now?
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of both of those. I wouldn't say that necessarily I was worried about getting robbed, but mostly doxed, or like yeah, doxed to my like employers at the time.
Hmm.
I just didn't want to deal with like what issues could have arisen from that if like my boss knew that I was doing this. I just didn't want to have that conversation with him. So that was a big thing. It was also, I think that when I started, there was not really much anybody else doing this. So it was like very it was a little bit of a lonely spot, and it was a very like contradictory spot. It's a bit like, I don't want to be necessarily kind of what's the word, like controversial with these things. It was just like this is something that I've noticed that I thought was interesting, that I think needs to be talked about more, and nobody was doing it. And I felt like I was in like a decent position to begin doing that just because I felt like I was pretty well educated on left-wing political issues and was working in the blockchain space. So like I had a lot of opinions and I could not find a single place like that said anything similar. It was very difficult for me and I was like very frustrated. And so it was like after being frustrated for like I think over a year that I was like, all right, fine, fuck it, I'll do it. Um, but like I said, I didn't want to be have to deal with the issues with my work and like I could I could imagine, like, I was imagining that if I was fully public, it actually would have been more cringe than it already was.
Hmm.
Just because, yeah, I mean, I was working a normal job and things like that. So it could have been easy to paint me in a certain way that I didn't think like actually reflected like my values and who I am based on like the surface of like internet identity of what you can find online. Um, so I use this. So I was anonymous as a way to also like kind of build a following, build relationships and like trust between people that then like once I did come out when I was asked, 'cause I was told that I needed to come out of the anonymous closet whenever I wrote the book. So then I already had kind of people who already knew me, already because I was doing my podcast for so long, I already had so many connections. It wasn't like a big thing. I had already proven kind of like my ideals and my values like before that happened. So I think that gave me, so then coming out of the closet, the anonymous closet was like more relaxed than I think it otherwise would have been. It also happened after kind of like the peak of the mania of like this recent bubble. Whereas was also the peak was also kind of like the peak of like people being pissed off if you were associated with crypto at all. So I think it protected me a little bit from that happening at that time.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the general trajectory of what's been happening? Maybe not so much in crypto natively, because as you mentioned, it is a anonymous. Most of the chains, and some of them are much more anonymous with something like Monero. But like outside of the native chains themselves, there's obviously a lot of front ends being built, right? There's businesses that are involved in some of these chains. Like if you're gonna be, for instance, like on Solana and you want to get like that Saga Solana phone or whatever, you're gonna have to contact them. You're gonna have to give them your address. You're gonna have to give them your email. Some of these, like some of these organizations, like they say, okay, we want your email address, phone number. We want your Twitter handle. We need you to post the following 5 items on Twitter, spaced 5 days apart. We need you to then post your Twitter links that you just made over in our Discord. And it seems to be, in some cases, much more like the anti-privacy measures are like much stricter even than like generic internet. And part of this has to do, I think, with the fact that these organizations are just kind of very extractive, right? Like these are companies that want to milk as much out of you as they can. And maybe you get to, keep some of your data, but overwhelmingly, they also start to keep, so much of your data. Like if you use like some of those crypto walking apps, they know exactly where you go every single, second. What's your normal route, that you take?
Yeah.
Like, so they could sell a lot and they require a lot out of you. Like what do you think? Like, have you noticed that same kind of trend where they're just, they're kind of recreating the same problems of the corporate internet in general?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think part of the reason why I'm interested in the space I mean, is both because of things that I find interesting in a positive way, and also the things that I'm like very terrified of. So I think there is a potential for like some serious dystopian stuff with this technology, which is why I feel it like useful for my time to like spend so much of it on this. But yeah, I mean, there is this kind of default thinking in the crypto space that if we financialize more, that somehow makes things better based on this like really silly idea of like perfect markets, or that
Mhm.
markets like move towards perfection, which is like kind of a silly thing to think at this point. Um, so yeah, I mean it's an issue. I think there's a contradiction and like a tension between like having a space that is default kind of pseudo anonymous, but then also like wanting to build a business and needing to prove identity in order to like give things away. um there is this tension that is like very hard to resolve at the same time. Like I think there's, especially between building, like staying anonymous and building solidarity, I think are a bit opposed to each other. Like in order for us to have like relationships of solidarity, like I need to know about you. Like I need to know a bit about who you are. What is your life? Like you cannot be an object to me. You cannot just be like an online avatar. I have to know something about you to build solidarity. So there's like a little bit of these contradictions in the crypto space. And there were these cypherpunk ideals um more in the beginning that have, I think, with the influx of venture capital, have like washed out a lot of it. Um so yeah, because I mean, venture capital, I think, is like one of the worst forms of investment you can like potentially take in most cases, and so they require, they have very high expectations for return, and so it requires like very high levels of extraction.
Mhm. Although, ironically, you did mention how early on when you were anonymous, it actually had the opposite effect, right? Where at the beginning it allowed you to build relationships in a way where being public would not have, but then ultimately the
Yeah.
doxing does occur. So and maybe we could
I,
like just oh, go ahead.
I would just say it's like not like a straightforward,
Yeah, yeah.
like there's no straightforward answer to this problem, you know? It's
Mhm.
like, should we all be fully anonymous or should we all be like fully not? Like I think there's no clear answer to that. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both. But yeah.
Hmm. But maybe we could briefly talk about some of the kind of like privacy networks, like Monero being, I think, the most famous one. I remember when I first came across Monero, and even like, maybe like a few years into it, thinking about it, I always thought, I can't like if I try to find a justification for why this should be legal, it's kind of hard to do it. Like I can't justify why this thing should at all be tolerated by any nation state. As a leftist, I'm not somebody that doesn't believe in a state. I want there to be a strong but not abusive state. I want a state that's actually fully accountable, but I still want there to be a powerful state. And if that's the case, like how can I possibly allow, like assuming I was, in this democratic state, if I was dictator for life, how could I possibly allow something like Monero? And I found a resolution actually, not through the thing about crypto, but I was listening to some interview that the founder, I forget his name, of Proton Mail, which is an encrypted email service, and he said something like, "Look, if somebody is targeted, right, by like the FBI or whatever for potentially doing something illegal, and they have an actual like warrant for this or that material, um, they then have to go directly to the person and say, okay, we have a warrant for this digital information that you have. We require you to show it to us. What Proton Mail does inherently is, assuming, of course, like they don't just like seize your computers and they're like unlocked or whatever. But assuming that's not the case, what something like Proton Mail does is it basically puts the ball into the court of the person using Proton Mail, right? Where now he has a choice. Okay, I could either comply with the law, right? Because if there is a warrant, right, that is under the auspices of the law, and I will hand over the information that's required of me, or I can choose not to comply, and there's like penalties, could be jail, like whatever it might be. And I thought that was a very intelligent way of discussing it because it automatically, like, it obviously creates a layer of privacy that would not exist otherwise, right? Because Proton Mail, like, even if they're asked, if they're subpoenaed, they can't actually provide the content of your emails to anybody because they themselves don't know. That's the whole point of this.
Mm.
So it's up to you, to make that decision for yourself. You have this responsibility. It's a more kind of radical responsibility, but also it limits state power, right? In the way of like, because there's going to be spying, right? That's not under the auspices of warrants. There's going to be spying that is illegitimate. If a Supreme Court would hear this case, it would be overturned, for instance, right? Like you can't do some of these things. So there's something, and Monero is the same way, right? Monero does allow you to comply with the law, right? If somebody asks, like, okay, so let's actually get a history of these transactions that are not garbled, through the Monero chain, and let's actually get, historical reenactment of what happened. It's up to you. You could either present this information as required by law, or you could say, no, I'm going to take the penalties. And I think that's probably the best in between state, where there is obviously a role for the state, right? The state is not just like, kicked out, but natively there is now more privacy. There's more power. If I think America could have it its way, if it could like dream this up 50 years ago, it would prevent, maybe the emergence of something like Bitcoin wallets. But now that it exists, like you're going to have to default to more privacy, more, person power than not, right? So like, what do you think
Mm.
about all this and privacy chains in general?
Yeah, I mean, there are, like I mentioned in the book, like a lot of these things in the crypto world are kind of double-edged swords, where of course they are things that can be that allow people to do things that are detrimental towards society, perhaps, but also it can be used to protect yourself at the same time. I think there is like this general, like my feeling is that we can't like I don't think like generally states are not they don't govern in the interest of the people, kind of like flat out. I think under capitalism, right, most states are very much captured by private interests and private entities. Like in particular, egregious example is the United States, and how much, I mean, like bribery is just straight up legal. We just call it lobbying. Um, so I think there isn't I think we shouldn't, as at least if we're looking at this from the perspective of like a leftist, we shouldn't just like assume that if something is legal, then it's good. And if it's illegal, it's bad. And like if we are like wanting privacy that is like as leftists, I think if you are on the more radical side at least, like you are in many ways and in many points in history would be considered a criminal, and you have to find ways to like protect yourself and your organization from like what those kind of like what those damages could be. So I mean, yeah, I think part of the intention with the creation of these more private chains is like to make cryptocurrencies more like the way that we use cash. Like, would we say as leftists that we should get rid of cash because cash makes up, 95% of the black markets, which is true, which is where how people most of the time not, pay their taxes is through cash. Is that should we make that illegal or like prevent that from happening? Like when cash is also at the same time a nationalized form of money, in that it doesn't rely on the use of any private entity, does not rely on the use of banks. Like cash is something that we can give between each other in person without anybody in between, with nobody stopping us. And we generally consider that to be a good thing. And so us being able to do that in a digital sphere, is that so different? I mean, yes, it is a little bit different in that I can send, Monero to someone across the world and send it very far away, perhaps. But it has like a similar intention. Um, so yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. I'm not really on the side of like thinking that states are somehow always in our best interest, and that like the left wing kind of position is like, oh, I love to pay taxes, like I enjoy doing my W-9s or W-2s or whatever they're called every year, but that we need to be realistic about if you are going to be agitating real capitalist institutions, and very anti-democratic ones and very authoritarian ones. Like we need to think about kind of like the risks that we're taking on and what are the first things that they're going to do to us. The first thing that they can do, as we've seen in countless examples, is prevent us access to our bank accounts.
Mhm.
That is like the easiest thing that they can do. They just send a little request to the banks, and they'll comply because they need to. So it is definitely not, again, one of those things that's like there is a clear morally correct answer. Um, but that right now I'm on the side of it being like me being okay that it exists at least, and I'm not going to call for like, you know, the banning of these things.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a bit of a tension. You mentioned this in your book between ideas of code is law versus social consensus. Because one of the important ways that we should also mention in terms of like what makes something a Bitcoin valuable is, if you do have like this digital asset and it technically can't be seized, like let's assume in the kind of like most extreme scenario, you never write down, any of these seed phrases and you just memorize them, right? And then you tell somebody else that you trust, okay, here's a seed phrase I need you to memorize for it for me every day, and you're going to practice it every single day so that you don't forget it and I don't forget it. And if one of us is the weak link, we could still have access to these funds. In that case, it would be very difficult for the state to seize it. They could do some kind of blacklist, but like ultimately, I think you could probably get around a blacklist. Maybe escape into a privacy chain or whatnot, and work your way out. Because again, like if you're a leftist and you believe that the state isn't perfect, right, in terms of like representing your interests, you're going to have to allow some room, therefore, something that is like somewhat outside of the auspices of the state, right? It's going to be kind of like, parallel to it, maybe not necessarily in 100%, maybe like not antithetical to it, but if anything, like long term, it could be something that it has very much a supporting role for the state, right? Gives the state more credibility. Because ironic, like if the state would have like come out early on very hard, like we're gonna quash Bitcoin, well, now that's a problem because suddenly Bitcoin has value by virtue of the fact that you just said this is so dangerous for anybody to have. If people could still get it, now we have the value because you're quashing it. That would also erode the credibility of the state, right? Like, what exactly are they so scared of? Why are they preventing us from, trying to have any of this? Why can't you just regulate it as opposed to outright ban it? Maybe this thing really is dangerous, but not in the way that they say. But yeah, there's this kind of conflict, right, between code is law and social consensus. And social consensus is like it's the law, right? Social consensus could be even like a mob mentality. You mentioned, for instance, the 2016 Ethereum hack, which it violated the precept of a code is law, right? We rolled back the blockchain because like when suddenly it's like when people are involved, they could lose a lot of their money. This is going to be a big problem for them. Nobody wants to lose their money, even if it's like a hack that, the DAO is not responsible for, like whatever. They don't want to lose their money. And for, Ethereum to continue existing, you're going to have to get some of this back. That's the social consensus layer, right?
There's also
That's
14% of like the total
yeah,
Ethereum
exactly.
supply at that time, I think, something like that, to
Yeah,
one
so
person.
so they come together and they essentially do this hard fork, and like you still have like some holdouts, like if you look at crypto Twitter, people that are like Bitcoin maximalists or types that really don't want any changes, even those that are just kind of like it gets to the point of it's such zealotry that it starts to like even make very little sense from the standpoint of if you're a big Bitcoin maximalist and you want this thing to succeed, why are you against ordinals if ordinals are like the thing that's been discovered recently that manages to solve like the Bitcoin security dilemma of, well, are we really going to be able to pay for its security because really not much is happening on chain, whereas like Ethereum has a lot more legroom in that way because it's a thing that's meant to be used in some way. So I mean, like, what are your thoughts on these kinds of conflicts in the community, social consensus versus code is law?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting how my read of the situation back then, what happened is kind of like, I mean, early crypto, at least at that point in like 2016 when the DAO hack was happening, was very, very libertarian. And by libertarian, I mean like a more right-leaning libertarian for the most part. And the more hardcore libertarians were on the code is law side. And then I would say the nuanced libertarians were on the social consensus side. And so what ended up happening, the DAO hack happened. People got mad about the fork or about the rollback, and then they forked. They created Ethereum Classic. It like pushed, it moved away. All of the hardcore libertarians went to Ethereum Classic, and then Ethereum was able to produce kind of a slightly different, slightly more progressive, although not progressive enough, I would say, culture within their crypto community as compared to Bitcoin. Whereas Bitcoin really, really stayed way more rigid, and that became like it was like not a bug, it was a feature, you know? The fact that you cannot change the Bitcoin code means that it's always going to stay the same, and that's what we want. It's kind of like there's a very like religious aspect to in Bitcoin maximalism that I think in Ethereum is a bit less, and there is more. I think that's why you have seen. I mean, we've seen the past few years, Ethereum has had way more innovation, more interesting applications, and more wide-ranging use of applications than Bitcoin has the past few years.
Yeah, I didn't realize that there was a substantial enough contingent of people that actually went over to Ethereum Classic. But it's kind of funny to view Ethereum Classic as the domain of like crypto Darwin Awards, right? Everybody that has untenable ideologies that they've sort of thought themselves into, right, into this like box. Okay, well, you could have your ghost chain, and have fun
Yeah.
with it.
But just to say, like, I think that it shows kind of how each in many ways, like each chain, the way uh, that it is constituted, or like what its features are, it attracts different politics
Hmm.
or creates different politics. So you can see like uh, Ethereum is much more pluralistic than Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is quite rigid, and there's only like, a couple of people with nuanced opinions when you go into like the
Hmm.
Bitcoin world. Whereas Ethereum, it's like there are many more camps, I would say. Although, and many of them are just like kind of either they want different technical changes or they have certain philosophical beliefs. But there's much more diversity there. And then with like Ethereum Classic, you had like very hardcore libertarianism, but also Ethereum smart contract interested, and it kind of flopped. So in like I think it's a bit maybe facetious to say, but in some ways you can kind of see how different politics play out economically on each chain. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think you could like tell, like, I mean, if you just go right now, when you look at the Ethereum people versus Bitcoin people, on Twitter, the kinds of personalities, like all the kind of like I don't know if anybody's been really canceled in crypto, but if anything is cancelable, like it would be mostly on the Bitcoin chain because of everything from like total right wing lunacy about immigration, outright racism to the point of using slurs, that kind of like extreme stuff. That tends to congregate a lot more on stuff like Bitcoin. Whereas I'm not sure how representative somebody like Vitalik Buterin is of Ethereum in and of itself, but and I have never really been able to truly pin down his politics, and I don't think he actually like has ever come out and said like, "Oh, I'm a socialist," or "I'm this, I'm that." He probably
Uh,
is a little bit too, he's kind of a little bit all over the place to say that. But it wouldn't surprise me that if when it's all said and done, that he would be probably a lot closer to our politics than he would ever be to something like the politics of. I also noticed that he followed you on Twitter, right? So whenever he does
yeah.
release articles, they tend to be, like his imagination of like what uh, crypto can do or perhaps should do is much more, it's much more diverse. It has many more moving parts than something like, digital scarcity. We need to get back on a gold standard. And guess what? Bitcoin is just a better
Max
gold.
Kaiser
So
type of stuff.
yeah, which is kind of funny. Like, on the other end, it is kind of interesting when you look at how, Bitcoin was introduced, and even to this day now, those on the, those are like right libertarian types who maybe like are writing for the von Mises Institute or whatnot. Many of them actually were, and maybe still are, against Bitcoin, which is,
Mhm.
which is like, I think there's a lot of motivated reasoning that they probably own a lot of gold, and they recognize that Bitcoin, it is
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
whether or not you like it, it is starting to compete with gold. I think it's probably going to at some point overtake the value of gold, and it shows that so much of what we consider to be true beliefs or like ideology that's based on reasoning, it is just psychological, in nature. It is motivated reasoning, because I've never quite understood why gold bugs would be so reluctant to embrace Bitcoin unless they fear, right, for their own financial stake. So
Mhm.
that's a funny like little emergence. um but maybe actually we should, because I normally split these into a show and an after show, and the patrons get the after show.
Uh-huh.
So if you guys want to see the rest of this conversation, I want to discuss maybe some things that you might not want to make so public, such as maybe we could rag on some crypto personalities. I want to talk about some more specific protocols. We have other questions in your book, such as like, I want to talk about, left wing versus right wing ideology when it comes to things like personal responsibility and how cryptocurrency tends to play into that, and a bunch of other stuff. If you guys want to see the topics, you would find them under the show notes, under the B side topics, both in the pinned comment as well as under the video description. And you could get that either through patreon.com/automachination, or in the very near future, you could join the YouTube membership program, and you could get that conversation as well. So we are transitioning to the patron show now.